Now, in the second of these videos, what I want to do is talk just a bit about the idea of phobias and anxiety. We see a lot of people coming in their 40s and their 50s who are beginning to experience a new feeling of anxiety. They're beginning to experience for the first time in their lives sometimes a type of, or a feeling of being extremely stressed. And sometimes it'll come in the form of panic attacks, or it might be a generalized anxiety, or it might be that they literally start feeling worried about confined spaces, elevators, fear of flying, that sort of thing. Now, what often happens in those cases is, and if you look at this graph, I'm getting better at this, I'm actually drawing the graphs and the illustrations before I put the camera on now. If you look at this graph, you can see the idea here. The stress level starts relatively low in a person's life, but as they get a little older, as they get up to 15 or 20 years old, it starts to go up. Now you'll see there's a red line across the top here. And this is just an illustration. It's just meant to be a bit of an idea. This is our threshold for managing stress. So as we're in our early 20s, maybe people going into university, whatever it might be, they feel a little bit stressed, but it's well below the threshold of the stress that they can manage. Now as they go into the beginning of their 30s, maybe getting married, life's pretty good, things are going well, and then suddenly along come the children. Now at this point you can then see the stress begins to peak, and it creeps above this red line. Now that's when we start seeing something unusual, and this is purely an imaginary example, but you might well see there that people start getting sleepless nights, and it's got more to do with, it's not just the kids screaming in the middle of the night. What we're seeing there is stress starts to press the individual, and their stress management then starts to become very important. Now because this is happening above this stress threshold, it can manifest itself in some unusual behavior or some unusual responses to stress. So for example, they suddenly become a little bit worried about flying, or they start to develop a fear of death. That's something which we've seen plenty of. Crossing bridges is another one. Now as things start to get under control again, it disappears beneath this threshold, this red line, and suddenly everything's manageable again. And everything's fine for a while, and then it creeps up above that threshold again, and we see it come out, either in the same thing, or perhaps something a little bit different. Insomnia is not unusual. Now, what's very interesting about stress is that it comes out sometimes in those fears, such as a phobia or sudden onset panic attacks, but it can also come out in a physical way as well. It's not at all unusual for people in their mid-30s to suddenly start experiencing hay fever, allergies they've never experienced before. And what we see in the world of hypnotherapy is it's often absolutely related to stress. Now, there's very probably medical reasons as well. I really don't know. I'm not a doctor, and I certainly wouldn't really want to be one. But in our world, we see a lot of people under a great deal of stress. And what we often see is that the way they deal with stress in the mid-30s, early 40s, starts to change a little. Just as when you're in your 20s, perhaps you can sink a lot of alcohol and a lot of bad behavior, and it doesn't affect you too much. By the time you're getting a little older, some of the way we deal with these things starts to change a little bit. We creep above this threshold. Now, the good news, and this is what, as a hypnotherapist, you can do for your client, is you can lift this threshold, this red line here. We can actually do a lot to change it and just move it, say, to here. In other words, all this other stuff becomes manageable again. And the way we do that is by looking after the absolute fundamentals for the individual, one of which is getting good sleep, another looking after the physical health of the individual. This helps them deal with stress. That regular exercise, getting a decent diet in place, looking after those things helps us deal with stress. And how many people in their mid-30s and 40s skip out to work really quickly and forget breakfast? Well, you know what? They're hurting themselves. They're hurting themselves quite badly. They're diminishing their own ability to manage with stress. Food gives us energy. That energy helps us deal with stuff. It's very, very simple. So as a hypnotherapist, an area which you can help your clients with very, very simply, and something which you can introduce into the client's life in an absolutely fundamental way, if they're suffering from stress issues, is getting down to the basics of reintroducing a degree of exercise. It doesn't have to be huge. They don't have to do an Ironman. But let's get some level of exercise in there. Reintroduce 3 regular meals a day. Sounds so obvious. Sounds so simple, but many people aren't doing it. Reintroduce quality food. They're better buying organic. They're better buying fresh foods than they are living on junk. Anything that comes from the outside aisle of the supermarket, that tends to be the good stuff. And of course, trying to reintroduce good sleep patterns is very, very key. Now, there are other things you can do. We always suggest to our clients who might be suffering from a little bit more stress than they need to read Dale Carnegie's book, Stop Worrying and Start Living. But we often go back to this graph where we look at the level of stress in the life. You can even chart it for an individual, go through their life, look at where the stress comes in, and then look at this red line. And here's another interesting bit. You can be in a situation where, let's say, they start using antidepressants, or they start using some form of drugs, or they start to use too much alcohol. Well, when you introduce a toxin into the body, it actually exhausts the body. And in fact, some of those antidepressants very likely are actually contributing to stress, because they're contributing a physical level of stress. And whenever you feel anything at a physical level, very likely you're going to have an emotional response to it. So look out for the effect of pharmacy on your client. Now, here's the last little point I'll touch on. I have a theory that instead of a flat line like that, actually, as people get older, we get that. We get a decreasing line. People deal with stress less well as they get older. So something which could have been manageable in their 30s, in their mid-40s, is actually peaking above that line. And that really could explain why some people who are doing just exactly what they used to do, but suddenly they're getting panic attacks, or suddenly they're getting outbreaks of night sweats. It could have something to do with the fact that the way they deal with stress diminishes as they get older. It's a personal theory, I don't know, but it's one you might want to think about. The final thing I'm going to say is, just touching on that whole idea of pharmacy can actually make some things a lot worse. If they are using a lot of toxins in their body, whether they be alcohol, whether they be pharmaceutical toxins, that does literally place the body under a physical stress. When the body's under a physical stress, sometimes you do get an emotional response. So keep that one in mind, and that gives you a little bit of an idea about how, on the Technical Hypnotherapy Association side, we think about how the body works with stress and how we can combat it. And we go back to the fundamentals. Deal with things at a physical level, exercise, deal with things with diet, and increase the emphasis on really good sleep. Now, those are all very general. You can also attack them at a very direct level as well. But this does give you a little bit of a background about how, in the Technical Hypnotherapy Association, we do think about the way that stress affects the individual.